Okay, welcome back to another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host, Omeed, and this week I'm interviewing Dr. Masha Petrova. She's a Ph.D. in aerospace engineering and the CEO of Nullspace. And Dr. Petrova spent 15 years in the engineering simulation and design software industry. She's held global marketing executive roles at Ansys, Altium, and also MSC Software during an acquisition by Hexagon. So really pleased to have you here, Dr. Petrova. And thanks for joining.
Thanks, Omeed. Masha is fine, but thank you for the title.
You're welcome.
Excited to be here.
Glad to have you. And fill in some more things for me. So I know you're CEO of Nullspace. You also are a PhD in aerospace engineering. Would love to hear a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, I was a real engineer at one point, and you and I talked before the podcast. It sounds like we have a connection since your dad was an aerospace engineer as well, which is pretty cool. And so after working as a real engineer for a minute, I decided I was way too extroverted, and so went into the sales and marketing side of things and led marketing and business development teams at various startups until I landed here, which is now I'm a co-founder and CEO of a very deep tech company called Nullspace, and we develop engineering software. So it's a tool for electrical engineers who are designing novel cutting-edge radio frequency technologies. So think antennas, radars. Your phone alone has 5 different antennas in it. And all those things are complex to design, and engineers need tools for them. And so Nullspace is a tool for electrical engineers to help them design new technologies.
Got it. And so Nullspace is a design software is what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
Design and analysis. Yeah. So when you think design, a lot of times people think actually drawing the shape or whatever it is you're designing. We're more of an analysis tool where once you've designed the thing, you need to make sure it works properly and performs properly. So you analyze it using our software, get the results, and then you can go back and redesign and change your design based on the results of the software.
Gotcha.
So it's you're simulating in a computer what's happening in real world, right? Kind of like if you think about a video game where it's simulating visually, right? The reality a little bit, except we're simulating actual real physics. So in our case, it's simulating electromagnetics. Complicated word. But essentially, it's something that's all around us, right? If you think about electricity and magnetism, all those things are governed by certain kinds of laws and equations, and we take those equations and we simulate them in a computer so that you could test to see whether your radio frequency technology or radar antenna radio is going to work properly. If our software says no, it's not, then you can go back, change the design, simulate it again, and get until in the computer you get something that works, and then you could build it in real life.
Got it.
And deliver it to the customer.
So it's like a CAD software, but for electromagnetics?
It's kind of like a step above CAD. So you have the CAD, and then once you have the CAD just give you the geometry. So CAD, or computer-aided design, just lets you literally, if you're sitting there and sketching on paper, with CAD, you sketch in the computer, and you just get the geometry of your design. We're the step after it, where you take the CAD, and then you say, okay, what if it now is actually performing, what is it doing electromagnetically? It's now emitting electromagnetic waves or receiving electromagnetic waves, and we simulate that piece. So it's the next step after CAD.
Cool. And so that's what you're doing currently, and you're the co-founder and CEO of that company. And, in the beginning of your career, you were an aerospace engineer, but you've been a part of a number of different companies leading up to this one. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And been through a lot of M&A activity, both on being acquired and the acquiring side, as the head of marketing, which has been very interesting to watch.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of the companies that you've been at that have been acquired. What are some of those companies that you've been at that have been acquired?
Yeah, so I spent most of my career in this very niche space of engineering software. So it's the CAD tools, engineering design tools, and simulation tools, which are engineering analysis tools. So I was just for kicks, some statistics I was looking online. So I think it's the Center for Occupational Employment states that only 5% of all employees in the United States are scientists and engineers, right? And we focus mostly on engineers, and a lot of the simulation tools are made for PhD level engineers. That's 0.01% of the population, right? So we work with this like small group of people who are engineers, and that's been who I worked with for a majority of my life. And I've spent a lot of time in startups, leading marketing, and also in a few large public companies. So we found out that before this podcast, when we were talking, that your dad and I were actually working in the same company called Ansys, and there was a lot of activity. So Ansys is an interesting company because it's very well known by pretty much every engineer. So Ansys makes engineering software tools, very complex software that simulates reality for engineers. Tools that help engineers build cars and planes and all biomedical devices, anything you could think of that's technology. Engineers typically use their software tools. And for a long time, Ansys was kind of like this, no one really knew about it unless you were an engineer, then all engineers knew about it. Because it was kind of like not very fast growing, sort of a steady company. It's been around for 40 years, and it would buy all the small startups in this space. First of all, this is not like the sexiest space ever when you think about M&A from outside perspective, right? Like if you're not an engineer, it's not a very sexy space. It's complicated. Like, I mean, in this time that I tried to explain to you what Nullspace does, and I tried to explain it in like as basic way as possible. It's not AI, it's not ChatGPT, it's not Instagram. And so in this kind of complicated space, the M&A activity was pretty much limited to Ansys and a couple of other big players in the space buying all the small companies. For a long time. And it was like the default. That's what would happen. You were just, as a small company, you're basically assumed you're going to be acquired by Ansys at some point. So I worked at a company called 3D Sim. I headed up their marketing for about a month before they were acquired by Ansys. So I was like in that acquisition process. It was very interesting to be a C-level executive, right? At a small company, going into a big company and watching and overseeing the acquisition and sort of a simulation of a small company into a larger one, and a simulation from marketing perspective, especially. And we can dive into that because that's very interesting to think about, and not a lot of people think through that. There was another company called OnScale that was also engineering software company that was a startup funded by Intel Capital, which is a venture capital firm, and Gradient Ventures that spun out of Google that I was VP of marketing for. I was there for about 9 months. I actually left Ansys to go there, and then they were acquired by Ansys. So it was like this very inbred soup for quite some time.
Either that or you're like a lucky charm where everywhere you go just gets acquired by Ansys, I guess.
Well, so I thought it was a lucky, this is so funny. I thought my resume was literally a lucky charm because the very first company I worked for as a real engineer was also a startup, also engineering software, also got acquired by Ansys 7 years or so after I left. And yeah, the joke was like everything on my resume gets acquired by Ansys. So Nullspace is, has probably a similar, except something happened in the last 5 months in our very complex, typically non-sexy space of engineering software. So if you kind of like watch what's been happening, and we venture capitalists are now catching up to this space because, again, for so long they've ignored it because it was such like slow, boring, complicated, niche feeling space. But now that the industry, there's so much M&A activity in the space, they are not paying attention. So Ansys was just acquired themselves for 16x revenue multiple by a company called Synopsys. It's also engineering software, but it's a little bit bigger. And they were acquired for $35 billion, and their revenue was only $2 billion per year. It's a multiple that's kind of like unheard of in our space. So like now the company that was acquiring everybody is all of a sudden acquired, and no one's been expecting it. And then there happened to be like another number of large acquisitions. Like you mentioned, one of the companies I worked for was called Altium. Also, if you're not an engineer, you haven't heard about it. If you're not an electrical engineer, you haven't heard about it. It was a public company on the Australian Stock Exchange, 200 million in revenue, like not that big by big company standards. Been around for 30 something years, go-to tool for engineering design. And then all of a sudden they got bought for $6 billion by a chip maker, a Japanese chip maker, 30 times the revenue multiple. 30 multiple. That's huge by like any standards, right? And especially in the space of engineering software, where again, like I said, no one understands it. It's not sexy. It's serving a market of 5% of engineers in the United States. So yeah, there's been just this crazy activity, and we think it's coming from the proliferation of AI chips driven by AI, advanced communications, So the whole ecosystem of engineering tools and engineering software is like moving pretty fast. So if anybody's listening and interested in like, oh, what should I acquire that's not typical run-of-the-mill type of company, this space is getting pretty heated.
Yeah, and I think that there's a movement towards, when the market tightens up, when cash when it stops flowing, I think most people start looking for the non-sexy markets because those are tried and true. Those are proven. The ability to profit and succeed in a niche market is actually substantially easier than, these kind of moonshot or sexy spaces. So like vertical SaaS, for example, starts doing really well, or traditionally performs incredibly well. But that definitely is a trend that we're seeing, right now as venture capital has slowed down in spaces outside of AI, for example. I think in general, people want proven, tried and tested channels, for financial success. So of course, like niche markets provide some level of guarantee in that respect. So
for sure. And if you think about it, just even if you're not familiar with engineering, have nothing to do with it, think it's complicated, all technology is built or is designed and tested and built at some point by engineers. The microphone you're talking on, the computer we're speaking on, your headphones, your smartwatch, the car you drove here, that's all been designed by engineers, right? So engineers are not going anywhere unless the society totally breaks down, and engineers need tools. And the part of that tool set is engineering software. And so I think that's and that's why I've been in the space for so long, because I feel like although I love entrepreneurship, I love startups, I do have a need for security and stability. And engineering software provides that because engineers are steady and reliable and make sure, for the most part, airplanes don't fall out of the sky. Cars don't just randomly start crashing into each other. Your smartwatch doesn't start showing the wrong time. I mean, sometimes it does, but for the most part, it's supposed to be reliable technology. And so I think that's a very, very safe space, even though it's complicated and you might not understand it. Engineering tools that are relied on and tried and true. It's a very safe space to bet on.
Yeah. So to go back to your acquisition history,
yes.
I think we were talking about the last one was Nullspace. I believe that's the name of the...
Or OnScale.
OnScale.
That's the last one. Yeah, so my acquisitions kind of like insight into acquisitions started when I was at MSC Software, which was acquired by Hexagon. Hexagon is a huge conglomerate manufacturer. I don't know how many billions of dollars in revenue. I think they're based in Europe, but offices everywhere. MSC Software was 200 million in revenue at the time when I was there, and I was head of marketing, global marketing at the company. And so I was just there for a year. I was a fresh, young executive. And while I was there, MSC acquired 3 other software companies, under my marketing watch, and then got acquired themselves in that 1 year. So that was kind of crazy. And I was supposed to kind of be in charge of assimilating first those small companies and then working with Hexagon, with a larger company that bought MSC, to assimilate all the marketing stuff into the large company. And it's so interesting to see it from the inside, because when I was an engineer, and I don't know if I haven't been through acquisitions, but I've seen, friends work at companies that got acquired or acquired other companies. And it's so easy to judge as an employee and think wow, it's just stupid. Why are they doing it this way? This makes no sense, and why are they changing to all of our PowerPoint presentation templates? And that's dumb. And they took away our coffee machine. And a lot of times, it doesn't make sense. But watching it from from the inside, when I was in charge of making those decisions, okay, how do we erase essentially the previous brand, but without disturbing the employees and the customers too much, but get rid of all the branding, right? And now make it seem like it's part of the big company, because there's different M&A or acquisition approaches, as at least from marketing perspective. You can either some companies leave the brand alone and it becomes, house of brands, or you want it to be branded house, where you erase the remnants of the old brand and kind of just want to simulate the technology and the customers under the big umbrella. And so there's different approaches to doing it and how it happens. But you're dealing with people, you're dealing with employees on both sides, you're dealing with executives on both sides, you're dealing with lawyers on both sides, right? Like something simple as a trademark or like changing a color sometimes would turn into this big drama between the lawyers. And so it's interesting. And I think the statistic is, and I don't know if you agree with us or not, but 70 to 90% of M&A or acquisitions fail. Essentially, would you say that?
What's interesting is that statistic nowadays is actually it's falling in terms of more acquisitions are becoming more successful because M&A activity is ramping up in ways that it hasn't before. So I think, the market is just becoming smarter with respect to acquisitions, and especially with a lot of the mid-market acquisitions, which are, the Cody Sanchez's and so on and so forth. Those numbers are driving more successful acquisitions because it's, smaller acquisitions. And so the integration often is and can be easier. But yeah, the 70% number for like the bigger companies who often, purchase companies for various different reasons, oftentimes to just, maybe to put a competitor out of business, for example.
Yeah, or just blow the stock price for a few days, right? Even that happens sometimes. And I think a lot of times as an employee, you don't realize that. You have no idea that the acquisition happened for no other reason than to bump the stock price up for like literally a week or so, and that's it.
But yeah, that is absolutely accurate. And where they always die is integration.
Right. And I always wondered, like with these big companies where it's just been such a from what I observed, right? It seemed like such a nonchalant approach to acquisition. Like, yes, we have one purpose, and that is to put a competitor out of business or to bump our stock price or whatever it is, right? Acquire a certain technology and just integrate it. And we only care about, the 10% of the technology of that company. And everything else, we don't care if it dies. And it seems like such a wasteful way to acquire. And it seems like if this was a more purposeful, like almost some sort of an education for specifically larger company M&A, where you don't discard so much of the rest of what you acquired, like you can actually reuse, reduce, recycle type of thing approach, right? And you can still get your goal of whatever it is, bumping stock price or putting the competitor out of business, but also like if there was some sort of a systematic way to like evaluate the employees, they evaluate the value of the brand or the marketing or the customers that you're buying and systematize that process, it seems like that failure rate could really go down. But I haven't seen any systematic approach to M&A like that. And
yeah, I mean, there are definitely M&A integration managers. That is a thing. There are people whose specific expertise is ensuring that the integration of two companies happens successfully so that it just doesn't fall on, the shoulders of certain people kind of willy-nilly after the acquisition closes. But what I hear you saying, which is really interesting, is how can we show larger companies actually how to be more effective with their acquisition so that they're actually getting as much out of the acquisition as possible? Because a lot of money is being spent not only in terms of the purchase price of the acquisition when one company is acquiring another, but also a lot of money is spent in terms of, making sure that the two companies are able to work with one another. And so, similar to the concept of like hunting, if like you go and you hunt an animal, but you only eat one part of it, for example, all of the rest of the animal goes to waste. So how could, using that same analogy, how could as much of the acquisition be utilized for benefit for these companies as possible? That's a really interesting kind of thought experiment.
Well, my analogy was recycling, but sure.
I totally did yeah, but we also, I'm not even going to take the conversation in that direction. But...
No, but you're right? Like, it seems like there's a lot of waste that happens during that M&A process. You still get what you want. Those larger companies still put a competitor, like we said, right? They put a competitor out of business, bought that little piece of technology that they needed, whatever. But just so much gets discarded that seems like there could be a lot of use, taken out of that. And as far as the M&A integrators that you mentioned, I've never seen one in person. I've never seen one utilized in my space. And maybe just because, again, in our space, it's not, for whatever reason, they're not utilized. I've never seen one in real life. And also, you probably have to be careful, right? Because what are the standards for them? What's the standard for an M&A? What did you call
integrator?
Integrator, right? How are they tested? If to be a lawyer or an engineer, there's very certain specific set of criteria that you have to pass to get that degree, right? With those integrators, is there something like that? And even if there's a standard or a certification or whatever, again, how do you know they're actually good? And how do you know? Because how do you measure the quality of an acquisition? How do you measure if you were able to get everything you possibly could out of that transaction? It seems like it's just it's a challenging probably process.
Yeah, I could see that. But I feel that, one aspect, for example, the case studies in terms of, other acquisitions that they have been a part of that have been successful in terms of the value that's been created. I think, that's an important metric in terms of integration. Good. One aspect in terms of the value that's been created is we're talking about, this waste that's created or acquisitions that have completely failed and haven't actually recouped the investment for the company. The opposite of that would be which acquisitions actually have recouped the investment for that company. If the integrator was a part of those are obviously case studies they could use. And I think there is a national integrators council or something as well. There is some sort of certification program. Or no, actually one of the integrators that we had on our show previously has a certification where they certify integrators.
Oh, well, there you go.
So
it's good to, and by the way, I'm not claiming by any means to be an M&A expert in any shape or form. So I'm just sharing my experience as being in it, right? Being in it as an executive, and to be fair, just a marketing executive, right? So my piece of it was, what do we do with branding? What do we do with, I saw customers on both sides, right? Stuff like that. So fair enough. I shouldn't probably even touch that area because that's not my area of expertise.
I am super curious from a marketing executive perspective, what that acquisition process looks like from the seat of being a marketing executive.
So from marketing perspective, it's interesting because marketing kind of gets the short end of the stick a lot of times, especially in this very technical B2B space. So B2B enterprise software space, we kind of are the afterthought. And, the lawyers get the first say, obviously, and, all the financial stuff, the financial people are important on both sides. And then marketing is well, just change all the branding, right? Or just change the template for the PowerPoints or whatever. That was the biggest pain point, is the changing the templates for the PowerPoints in all the M&A, spaces that I was in. But I don't know if I have any good takeaways from that. I just was very personally, as a head of marketing, I mean, it took a lot out of me, every single acquisition, because I was very careful to try and think about the heads of marketing and the companies getting acquired when we were acquiring companies, and their customers and their employees. But at the same time, you got pressure from your large company, right? From where you're sitting in your C-suite, and they want stuff, and they're well, where's the revenue? They said they have, whatever, millions of dollars in revenue. Where are those millions of dollars coming from? And who are their key customers and all that kind of stuff? And so you just kind of have to dive in and quickly develop strong relationship with the marketing team and the executive team on that side. And it's not easy a lot of times, because a lot of times the smaller company that you're acquiring, I was just going to talk about, large company acquiring a small one. And if you're on the acquiring side as head of marketing, the head of marketing has been the god of marketing in their small little bubble for maybe years sometimes, right? And they think they're important, and they were for a long time. And it kind of hasn't hit them yet what actually happened. They're not, I'd hate to say this, but if we just look at from business transaction perspective, they're not really that relevant anymore, right? And so a lot of times they would like put up a fight. They could block information from you. They could just make your job easy, harder. And so sometimes that could be a headache if you don't have a good backing. Or, I was lucky that I was head of marketing and I could kind of I had levers that I could push and get what I needed and get things done. But a lot of times that M&A activity falls on the marketing managers, right? If you don't have a strong CMO running the show or strong head of marketing, So if you're some poor marketing manager having to deal with the acquisition, I can't even imagine like that just must be a nightmare. And then on the other side, so one story I have is Ansys acquired a startup. It was engineering software that helped predict how a 3D printed part will be printed before it's printed. Right? Like this was a software for 3D printing, engineers designing 3D printing parts. I was with a small company for just a month. I just came in. We just put together all of our marketing strategy and like trade show calendar and all that kind of stuff. Messaging, because that wasn't there. And then we were acquired by Ansys. And Ansys was a much larger, $2 billion in revenue company. And we were just a small little startup. And so, like now I got to experience what it was like to be on the other side and be the small marketing manager who is now like getting sucked into this big machine.
Yeah, you just talked about how as a marketing manager getting acquired by the bigger company, like it kind of makes you obsolete. So you've experienced it on both sides, it sounds like. So I'm curious, what was that like?
So I was coming out fresh out of, I think it was like 4 acquisitions, right? When I was at the larger company, we acquired 4 companies and then we were acquired by a much, much larger company. And then I was in the startup being acquired again. So I was fresh from like the cycle of acquisitions and again, overseeing the marketing piece of all the acquisition stuff. Realizing very clearly that I am nothing. At this point, I am irrelevant, right? And so that really helped because just having that very humble point of view that I am just here to help, like they've got their own process and I'm going to work
as
with
like
them.
Being integral to the transition process rather than important to the like continuation of the business operation.
Of the little brand. Right. Like it was very quickly for me, like the switch went on like, okay, we're no longer going to be relevant. What's relevant is now the big company that bought us. That's where the money came from. And so like, that's who I'm supporting at this point.
Right.
Yeah, I think that was very, very helpful in terms of it made it really easy so Ansys at that time was acquiring all kinds of companies. They were having multiple acquisitions per year and their salespeople who were very well paid have a portfolio of these engineering solutions. The salespeople are typically not engineers. And now imagine they have a portfolio of these very complex engineering tools they have to sell to very sophisticated engineers. It's hard, right? And now we were just one of the small little startups that would get shoved into their portfolio of 50 things they have to sell already. And then I had, as a head of marketing, I had like a quota a goal that we set up with the acquiring team from Ansys of how many seats of our software we wanted the salespeople to sell. Well, salespeople could give a crap about you, right? And if I came in not being on the other side of the acquisition, I would have just assumed like, oh, we're so important. We got acquired and, the salespeople just need to get on board and like, sell a tool because look at how good we are. Like Ansys bought us. But because I was lucky enough to be on the other side of the big company, I knew that like we were just, a drop in the bucket. And salespeople couldn't care less. So I worked really hard to make sure to understand, okay, well, so I talked to a lot of the sales leadership at the big acquiring company, Ansys, and I said, okay, like, what do you salespeople need? What makes them sell a certain tool over other tools? How can we stand out? And essentially, I switched marketing the little company to the world to marketing inside of Ansys to their salespeople. So I was invited to their sales kickoff, which is very rare that they have a company that they acquired, like, a head of marketing from a company they acquired to go to the sales kickoff. I was on stage in front of all their salespeople and we got the salespeople super excited about the tool, even though it was hard to sell. It was not easy. There were issues with the tool itself, but we certainly got excited. I would sit in all the sales kickoff meetings and I would be like the only marketing person that would be, willing to kind of like get in there with the salespeople. I would go to customer meetings.
Well, you aligned yourself with the objectives and the initiatives of your acquirer. And so that's what made you incredibly valuable. What made you incredibly valuable was you understood, okay, we're not here to acquire market share the same way that we were. When you were at the smaller company that was getting acquired, you had your marketing channels that would acquire your customers the way that, that you would acquire your customers. But now that you'd been acquired, for the acquirer, their customer acquisition channel was through their sales team. And so you understood
exactly
that if the acquirer is going to be successful with this acquisition, their sales team needs to be properly equipped with the tools to sell this new product that they've added to their suite of products. And so you became, a cheerleader for the product, or you became a champion for the product from within the organization to empower the sales team within your acquirer to leverage their acquisition as much as possible and be successful through the acquisition by having what they needed to sell the product the way that they needed to sell it, which is, it's genius.
Exactly. Well, I don't know, it's genius. I think I was just beaten up enough. I was lucky enough to be on the other side and to be the C-suite during the acquisition process, like on both ends, before I was acquired, the company was acquired by Ansys. And so it was really easy for me. I mean, as soon as that check is signed, the contract is signed, the contract is signed, you have to switch, right? Oh, sorry, it's a bubble. Keep coming up. You have to switch kind of like your thought process and like, okay, what is my goal now, right? And it was really easy for me to make that switch because I've seen it and it wasn't shocking to me and so on. But I've seen people really struggle, I got to say. Like there was a salesperson that was hired by the small company that Ansys acquired along with me. And he was there for a while. He's never been part of an M&A activity before. He's never been really an executive. He was just a salesperson, right? He was like leading the sales for that company. And he struggled too, to the point where Ansys like had to just get rid of him because he just refused to change what his priorities were and what his purpose was. And it was like me against them. And there was a few other sales engineers, or not sales engineers, but like support engineers who were like that too. They kept holding on to this little dream that, no, this is our company and doesn't matter who buys us, which is kind of a very immature approach. Like if you really think that nothing is going to change now that you're acquired and you're still going to keep doing what you're doing and then you're going to, fight the beast. And it's just a dumb way to look at things. I think. Well, I mean, it was very fun.
You're not aligning with the interests of the acquirer, and that's opposed.
Right, you're not helping anybody.
Yeah. And you're not helping yourself either. I'm curious, so you've been through a lot of acquisitions, which is like super interesting. And because you have a lot of experience with acquisitions specifically. Most people don't have as much M&A experience as you have in terms of being on both sides of the M&A transaction, in terms of companies you've been at being acquired and companies that you've been at acquiring. Most people don't have this type of experience. So I just want to point that out. Even for a lot of the people on our show, it's often people that are either acquirers, and so all they do is they just acquire businesses, or it's founders that have been through acquisitions a few times. We have not yet had a guest that has had as much experience being on the sides of the acquisition process as you have. So I think...
Wait, here, let's do. Is this going to do the firework?
Oh, yours did confetti. Interesting.
Oh, confetti.
That's cool too. Confetti works.
Yeah.
And so you're actually offering really great takeaways, which it's, for the founders out there that are being acquired, it's incredibly important for you shift your objective. That's the key principle that I'm hearing here. It's no longer about your company. It doesn't have to do with your company anymore. Once you become acquired and you agree to work under the umbrella of your acquirer, your objective needs to align with the objective of the entity, the organization that acquired you. That's how you're going to succeed post-acquisition and how you're going to create the most value for the acquirer. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily care to create value for the acquirer. A lot of times founders just check out after the acquisition.
Yeah, sometimes they check out. And for founders, to be fair, let's put a caveat in there. For founders, if you were acquired, you probably got a nice big paycheck, right? You were probably exhausted as all heck, right? Like you probably ran a marathon for years at this point and you're just freaking tired. And you just got to pay out, So I can see how, not that I condone it, but I can see how if a founder checks out, it's at least logical to some extent, right? However, when you're an employee and you refuse to give up like what you're fighting for, and you refuse to like stop, and so I'm Russian, right? I'm moved from Soviet Union back in the day, and there's a saying in the Russian language. It says, can I say it?
Yeah.
I'll say it in Russian, and I'll translate. But the saying goes, кто платит, тот и музыку заказывает. And what that means is whoever is paying orders a song on a jukebox, right? So like, just if you're in the acquisition process and you've never been, like, you're either getting acquired, and right now there's a lot of M&A activity, so I think it's important for people to think about if you're an employee and you're in the acquisition process and you don't know what's happening and you think like, you know, the people who are buying us are assholes and we're still going to do what we're going to do and we're going to fight the good fight and like we're the company that's always been there. If you don't pause for a second and think about like, there was a big check that got signed and your bot, the purpose changed, right? And like to try and fight the acquirer is like, it's not going to make your company independent again.
There's a flip side to this though, too, which is the flip side is the acquirer could have also failed in the enrollment of the acquisition target. In terms of the transition process, it's incredibly important in an acquisition that the employees of the company that you're acquiring are aligned, and so that you do what's necessary to win their trust. Because typically in an acquisition, everyone that works at the target that's being acquired, they fear for their jobs, they, these sorts of kind of misalignments start to happen. And the really successful acquirers are the ones who are able to quell the fears of the workforce of the company that they're acquiring, the ones who are able to enroll the workforce of the company that they're acquiring. So the responsibility, and I'm not sure if that's the case here. It just sounds like these may have been like a few outliers, but there is like a lesson there for acquirers too, in terms of what is the process that you're following to win the favor of the company and the employees of the company that you're acquiring. Because what we know, one of the major value loss aspects for acquisitions, and we gave that statistic, 70 to 90% of acquisitions are usually failures. Yes. One of the primary value loss leakages is specifically with workforce.
Oh yeah.
So recognizing, go ahead.
Yeah, and I don't mean to excuse the behavior of the acquirer or say like they have, doesn't matter what they do, you still have to adjust. I think I was looking at it, if just putting myself in the shoes of the employee, where you have no control over what the acquiring company does, right? Like you can say they shoulda, coulda, woulda, and all the things that they should do, but it doesn't matter, right? At the end, you can only control yourself. And so I'm just kind of like putting myself in the shoes of the employee getting acquired. Right? Doesn't matter what the acquirer is doing. The check's been signed. The contract's been signed. The company's acquired, right? Like, what can you do? Yeah. But yes, absolutely.
What comes up for me though is like, does the employee have incentive? I obviously don't know what the contracts look like after the acquisition, but does the employee have incentive, to align themselves with the acquirer, for example? Or is it just that they literally transfer over and they're like, well, this isn't necessarily what I want to be doing anymore. I kind of just got shoveled over onto this other side. And actually what they're really doing is they're setting themselves up to leave the company that acquired them, essentially. So they're just kind of like angry and they're like, you know what, I don't even want to be a part of this anymore. Maybe because the incentive isn't there, maybe because the enrollment hasn't happened, maybe because, their opinions and thoughts and feelings, weren't extracted during the acquisition process.
Fair enough, right? Like, and that there is a whole, I am not qualified to talk about it, but I'm sure there's a ton of things that the acquirer could be doing to make sure that the employees are aligned, not to lose talent. I actually have a story on that as well. So when we were acquired by Ansys, when one startup was acquired by Ansys, the CEO of the small startup really cared about his people. And he really put together a sweet deal for the employees transitioning over to Ansys, to where it was something like, so we got a bunch of Ansys stock, and Ansys stock at the time was like gold, because again, it was very stable, reliable, steady growing company. You know what I mean? Their stock was always increasing. So it was like better than cash. So we all got Ansys stock through as we transferred over. And my stock was something like, it invested over several years. And every year that you stayed with Ansys, you got more Ansys stock. And it wasn't chump change. Like, it was a good chunk. And I was only with a small startup for a month, and I got pretty sweet deal in terms of like the stock. And I know other employees did well. And not only that, but the CEO of that small company like cared about the employees so much that he actually negotiated a deal where if you were fired by Ansys, you got all your stock that was supposed to be vesting in advance, right? And so to make it very simple, I'm sure there were nuances, but something like that. And so I was with Ansys for about a year, and my feelings weren't really taken into consideration all that much. I was a very hard worker. I clearly had a ton of experience. I understood M&A, but I wanted to head up marketing, and I became from heading up marketing to be a cog in the wheel. And although I did a lot of really cool stuff and the sales teams were amazing, and there were some leaders on the M&A side and the sales side of Ansys at the time who were awesome, and I loved working with them, but I became depressed because again, I went from being a leader to again being a cog in the wheel. And so I left Ansys to go to that other startup that then got acquired by Ansys later. to go to,
Ansys
and then,
just
so I
like
left
follows you around and acquires all the companies that you go to.
I know. So I left this very stable position that I had at Ansys, right? That I could have easily kept for years. There were people at Ansys that have been there forever, and maybe they weren't super happy, but they were fine, and it was a paycheck, and they were just there. And so I could have been one of those people. Not only that, but I had years of Ansys stock. And so that stock, if you got fired, you got all of it. If you left, you left it on the table, right? So supposedly they did what you're saying, right? They incentivized the employees to stay with Ansys, but they didn't incentivize like the real growth-oriented leaders like me because stock was not enough. So I left hundreds of, thousands of dollars on the table to go to unknown, to go to a startup, right? Like completely unknown entity, just so I can continue to grow and learn and progress because those incentives were not there for me, right? The incentives were for someone who wanted stability and who wanted to coast and do what they do every day, and that worked for them. But for me, it didn't. So I think for acquirer side of things, there are important things to consider, like what are those incentives? And sometimes it's not just money for a lot of people. It depends who is it that you want to really keep on the acquisition side, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's really one of the roles of the integration manager. He talks about getting everybody into the room and having like a real conversation with everyone in terms of, what are the interests? Where do we align? Where do we not align? How do we align? And so yeah, that's a great point. I love that. I'm curious though, to circle back to your role in the companies that were acquiring. So where you were the marketing person and you are acquiring companies. I heard that, one of the biggest pain points for those companies is changing over the PowerPoint templates.
I mean, I joke, right? But yeah, honestly, it was from marketing perspective, it was biggest pain in the butt because PowerPoints are used for salespeople use them, right? The engineers would use them, the sales engineers, support engineers. Internally, they would be used for like quarterly business reviews and board meetings and all that kind of stuff, right? And so it's funny, like if somebody could come up with a way to quickly change up PowerPoints like in real time for everyone, that's not all online, that would be great. But
the difficulty would be that, there's XYZ number of employees and XYZ number 99 employee might still be using the old PowerPoint presentation because they're just like a stick in the mud and they don't open their emails, for example, and see that the new guidelines or that they, have to use this new PowerPoint template, or they just don't care. Like,
or they don't care, right? And again, if there's no incentives for them to care, right? So it was interesting. So when I was in MSC Software was when the acquisitions were happening, and I was on the acquirer side of head of marketing. The CEO at the time had a philosophy of where he acquires companies, and he was very adamant about it. So it was very important to stick with that philosophy. He doesn't change the branding. He doesn't change anything about them. He just gives them resources and they grow. Whether that worked or not, I'm not sure. I wasn't there long enough, but that was his philosophy. So that made it almost harder because the small companies we were acquiring, the marketing people still felt important because they felt like, oh, look, they're not changing our branding and like they're have to work with us and so on. So like my power as a head of marketing was taken away in a lot of sense, and kind of like I was forced to sort of into this political negotiation, which seems like, well, maybe that's a good idea. You're not strong-arming anybody. You're like having a conversation. Well, except where like the small company, head of marketing really thought they were a lot more important than they were. And then you can't get anything done because now I have 3 companies that I acquired, and one's in Japan. One was, and like they had weird names, like the company we acquired from Japan, one of the software tools was called Pickles. And it's like, what am I supposed to be doing with pickles? Like, really? So,
sounds like the family pet or something.
Right. Or something should be in the refrigerator. Yeah. But so there was like strange naming conventions. And again, like colors you don't think about, but for example, pink in like Indian culture is not seen as feminine. Pink is like both feminine, masculine, doesn't matter. It's just a color. Or like other type of colors that are associated with certain type of traditions or holidays and whatever. And so like one company was German, one company was from Japan, and the third one was, I don't remember, I think Europe as well. And they were all allowed to keep their branding, and they were told like, you're running as usual. But as head of global marketing of the large company, I was being asked, well, why aren't we acquiring more customers? And why aren't they doing this with lead generation? And, like, why does their booth look like that? Because people, like the German marketing for small companies could be very quirky sometimes. And it just wasn't fitting in with a large American cutting edge software company. But I couldn't do anything about it. Like my hands were tied. And that was very hard because it became a diplomacy. I became like almost like a diplomat as opposed to like head of marketing trying to negotiate. I don't want to say negotiate with the terrorists. They weren't that bad. They weren't bad people, but they were just...
But it sounds like it was challenging for you. It does sound like it was challenging. It was very,
yeah, because the pressure was, like one of the companies was a German company, and at the point they had this funky marketing with a frog the prince with a crown. I don't really know how it worked, but it was like you have to kiss a lot of frogs to get to the prince, except it was like in reverse, and it was just, the frog was weird with the crown, and like it worked apparently in Germany for a small little quirky niche company, but it didn't work with a large cutting edge technology company in America. And they refused to give it up, and so they would have these booths, and then they would take pictures of the booths with the frog, and that would be all over the social media, and then I would get asked like, what in the God's name is that? And, I'd have to give it a response. But
yeah, which is interesting because the approach of the company was to let the companies be standalone brands. So it's surprising that they were surprised by the fact that, these brands continued to operate the same way that they did with respect to marketing, because it's like, well, this is your approach to acquisitions. You let these brands maintain their positions and the identities. Yeah. Oftentimes, like a lot of PE companies will kind of take this like platform roll-up approach where it's like, cool, we'll, acquire you. We might, make some aspects of the business. We'll consolidate some aspects of the business back of house, accounting, finance, that sort of thing. But, you get to maintain your own brand identity. You get to maintain your own dev team, for example. But yeah, these aspects over here, we'll consolidate these and they'll get rolled into our platform. And that's how the companies are managed. But yeah, it's interesting hearing the challenges. And so it sounds like that was a huge challenge for you. What was the big learning or the takeaway there? What would you have done different if you could go back?
I don't know if I would have done anything different, because at the time, so it was very stressful on me, right? I lost a few years of my life probably during that year, but I don't know if I've done anything different because it was a huge learning opportunity for me. So I think for a company that has that strategy of like, let the, house of brands, let the brands be what they are, then you're right. This was a PE-owned company. The large company was PE-owned company at the time. If you take that approach, you should already have very well established your own core marketing as a large company. At the time, they didn't. The marketing for the large company was not well established. So I was building everything from scratch. I was building product marketing from scratch, PR from scratch, it was kind of all in disarray. And they also had 50 different products. They all had to be very cohesive, because remember that large company was also getting ready to be acquired, and they were acquired by Hexagon in that same year where those acquisitions happened. So I had to package it all up with a pretty bow so that it was ready to go for the acquisition themselves. just from marketing perspective, right? So there was pressure from keeping like building the branding and building the marketing for the large company while also leaving the brands alone, but at the same time kind of like making them look like they're still part of the brand. So it was a very complicated problem to solve, and I wouldn't change anything just because I was like excited by that challenge of how do you solve something like that. It's not sustainable, and I mean, I couldn't do it for more than a year or two. I would have killed anybody like trying to push that. And so I think, if you're in that situation as head of marketing and that's what you have to deal with, I think maybe you build what you can, and at some point you have to kind of stop, and I hate to say stop caring, but like really stop putting that much emotional energy into it. I wasn't ready to do that because it was a challenging problem to solve, and so I wouldn't change anything else. Essentially, the way I managed it was to become, like you said, essentially treat myself more as a diplomat than, hey, I'm in charge of marketing. There was a lot of negotiation. There was a lot of time on the phone. I think my team was really strong at the time. I was lucky that I was able to kind of build my team from scratch. And we were all in sync. So it was a very small team. I only had 8 people, I think, at the time. But it was and they were young, but they were very good and very talented. And they were willing to follow me, like my leadership, I should say, right? And so we would have meetings together. We would make sure we were all in sync and we were a unit. And that took crap loads of energy and time. But kind of that helped a lot because I knew that if they're off doing something, they're executing our team's vision. They're not doing something off on their own, because that just definitely would have been a nightmare. So I would say that's the biggest learning is like, if you could put together at least a strong team and you can control that, and your team understands what your vision is and purpose is, and you're clear with your goals and clear what you're trying to do, that will be a huge help.
Very cool. Yeah. So we're nearing the end of the episode. There's been a lot of really good information here. Just to kind of close things out, is there anything in closing that you want to share? Maybe like a final tip for, either people going through acquisitions or that are acquiring as, head of marketing? Is there any sort of kind of final tip you want to share with people? If not, that's okay too.
Final tip. I think probably for anyone going through an acquisition who hasn't gone through it before, whether you're a company owner that's been acquired, right, or an acquirer, or just an employee, or whatever your role is, I think realizing that acquisition is a change. It's a big change. It's a big change in priorities, and you can't keep doing things. Even if you're told like nothing is going to change and keep doing what you're doing, don't believe that. Don't buy that. Acquisition is a change. So stop, like take a day off if you have to, take a weekend, take a couple of days off, and research the company that's acquiring you, right? If you're on a smaller company side that's being acquired, research them, think about what their priorities might be. What might change? Even if you're being told that nothing will change, it will. That is a lie. So just prepare for it. Prepare yourself mentally that you will have to change. And don't be in this bubble like, the ostrich with its head in the sand, like pretending like, la, 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 it's all going to be the same. It's not. It's changing. So just the sooner you can accept it, and the sooner you could say, okay, things are changing. What am I going to change to kind of like ride the waves and make this situation the best for me, the better off you'll be.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for that final tip. And thanks again, Masha, for joining us, Dr. Petrova, everyone. It's been a real pleasure. Really enjoyed this conversation. A lot of little gold nuggets in there. And for all the listeners out there, you'll be able to find more information on Masha in the description below. I'll drop her LinkedIn. I'll drop, her link to Nullspace as well. So you can check her out and find more about her. She's also got a lot of other great podcasts that you can check out too that she's been on. And as always, thanks for listening this week. We'll see you next week. Make sure to follow, subscribe, like, comment. Let us know, what did you get from this episode? Leave your takeaways in the comments or reach out. Send me an email. You can find my email in the description below as well. And we'll see you next week.
Yay. Thank you so much, Omeed.